Constitutional crisis. This is a big, scary, heart-stopping term that you've probably heard more than once in the past few couple of days. Between the recent government shutdown and the devolving Trump-Russia collusion, obstruction of justice, whatever that whole mess is turning out to be, people are fixated on what happens when the system fails. And this is a good question, and particularly in regards to the government shutdown, I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, did government actually fail? Because it seems to me that the system worked. It may not have worked in the way that we wanted it to, in the most efficient and smoothest way possible, but it did work. You had a minority party in Congress, the minority, which, by the way, is there as another check on government power. The majority is not simply able to just steamroll their way through towards legislative victory. So they tried to play their hand, tried to get the majority to go along to get what they want, and then when that gambit didn't work, they folded and went along every way. And in the long run, we got well, not a budget, but we got yet another continuing resolution so that we can go through the whole mess again in a couple of weeks. So that to me doesn't really seem like a failure of government. If you want to make the case for a failure of government based on the fact that we are, now 4 deep in continuing resolutions and we don't have any sight of a budget, and we haven't had one since 2008, well, that's another story. But again, I would question whether this is a failure of government as such, or whether it is simply a abandonment of the principles underlying the framework of government. And by this I mean that Congress is, yes, lazy, shirks their responsibility, and likes to do things in the short term because then they can prioritize political solutions that don't really solve anything, but that sort of shunt issues, particularly those that are really controversial, further down the line so that hopefully their successor can deal with them. But is this Congress's fault, or is it the fact that we've allowed Congress to become this way? Is it the fact that for most people like you and I, or maybe not you and I if you're sitting here watching me talk in detail about politics, but for a lot of average Americans, politics is a nasty word. It's a pejorative. It's something to be avoided. It's something that comes up only every 2 or 4 years when you go to the polls, either at a state or a federal or a local level. It's not something that's a lot of deep introspective thought is given to. And part of what has happened as a result of this is the federal government, and Congress in particular, has really expanded itself well beyond its powers. Pretty much everything now is settled at a federal level. But at the same time that it has expanded horizontally the things that are in its purview, it's also gotten a lot lazier. Right, so Congress has more responsibility, and it does nothing to actually deal with this responsibility. Now, this we can call a failure of the system because we've abandoned federalist principles, right? What needs to happen to fix that is for people like you and me or Joe Schmo on the street to actually get involved, to become more engaged citizens, to really participate in self-government, to be governors of ourselves as well as involved in governing our communities and in our states, and also at the federal ballot box as well. But as to whether things like government shutdowns represent a failure of the underlying government structure, I think the standard for that needs to be when there is simply no reconciliation possible. It's tempting every time we don't get an outcome that we like, or every time we get a messy outcome, i.e. you've got senators standing in the well of the Senate shouting at each other about, is it the Trump shutdown, is it the Schumer shutdown, more concerned with passing the blame onto the other political party and to their partisan agenda than in actually using that energy towards something productive and towards actually producing legislative solutions. But even though that doesn't look good, it's bad politics. It lowers trust in government and makes citizens feel that they're have an overall negative view of government. That is not a failure of the system, because the system still works. Ultimately, government is reopened. We found a compromise, right? A word that a lot of politicians like to throw around a lot, like it's some halcyon standard for action, even though compromise, I don't think, is a good basis for politics. But I would just really question casting snafus like that as failures of government, because what that does is then set us up for a politics where every time something goes awry or gets a little messy, we see it as a failure of government, implying that government is supposed to be this smooth functioning, well-oiled machine that, just runs on time all the time, like a train that functions perfectly, gets where it needs to go, all that sort of thing. And that is simply not the case, not only in terms of how our federalistic system works, but just in terms of the idea of democratic government. And not purely democratic government, obviously, but representative government, where there's this idea that the majority does not simply rule by right of the fact that it's the majority. Deference is paid to the minority. Their rights don't go away simply because they're in the minority, which means we have to have this dialogue. And because we have different factions and different perspectives, and government is supposed to be largely neutral and cannot say, well, we think that the majority view is right and the minority is wrong, because it can't make value judgments like that, or at least it's not supposed to, you're going to have a messy and a fractious process. And that's not something that we should look on as inherently negative and as something that is a flaw in the system.